Okay. In what way is psychoanalysis a useful theory, model, or bundle of concerns for Elizabeth Abel? Right. And this is her book, Virginia Woolf and the Fictions of Psychoanalysis. What purpose does it serve in her interpretation of Mrs. Dalloway? It is clear from the get-go that psychoanalysis structures Abel's vision of the novel. Much like Freud's theory of gender and sexuality, which he explains, remember, as phenomena that develop and take shape over a life, rather than existing as unchanging essences throughout one's life, Abel reads the novel as, quote, a developmental story that is intrinsically disjointed and textually dispersed and disguised, end quote. This is on page 30. And just as psychoanalysis might look for deeper roots in any compulsive behavior or romantic relationship, typically going all the way back to the father and the mother, so too Mrs. Dalloway, quote, cloaks a less orthodox emotional history, end quote, behind the fragments of a traditional courtship plot involving Clarissa, Peter, and Richard. In short, psychoanalysis equips Abel with a way of seeing and reading that attends not only to how the text is presented to us, as in New Criticism and Structuralism, but to what its presentation cloaks or veils. What evasive moves are at work in the presentation itself, which can then be read as moments of repression, or as strategies of displacement, disguise, and dispersion. Psychoanalysis aids Abel in noticing the importance of what isn't there, isn't stated, what's pushed to the side, even as this absence exerts some sort of pressure on the narrative and on its characters. So, what does any of this mean? Namely, that when we start reading psychoanalytically and asking how we know what we think we know about Clarissa's past, that we notice something interesting, namely that Clarissa herself, when she thinks about Burton, is less interested in it as a space of courtship and romance than in demarcating it as what Abel calls, quote, a pastoral female world, which is spatially and temporally disjunct from issues of marriage and the socio-political world of Richard's London, end quote. Okay. Let's read Abel's second paragraph because that comes at the end of that paragraph, in order to help flesh this out for us, why this may be important or interesting. So page 30, the second paragraph on 30. Woolf selects with precision the consciousness through which to reveal specific segments of Clarissa's emotional history. Although Clarissa vacillates emotionally between the allure of Peter Walsh and that of her husband Richard, she remembers Peter's courtship only glancingly. The burden of that plot is carried by Peter, whose memories Woolf relates, through whose memories Woolf relates the slow and tortured end of that relationship. Clarissa's memories, by contrast, focus more exclusively on the general ambience of Burton, the home of her adolescent years, and on her love for Sally Seton. Significantly absent from these memories is Richard Dalloway, whose courtship of Clarissa is presented again exclusively through Peter's painful recollections. Clarissa thinks of Richard only in the present. Through this narrative distribution, right, Woolf constructs two poles structuring the flow of Clarissa's consciousness. Burton to Clarissa is a pastoral female world, right, that is linked up with the past, with the love of a young girl, and that is spatially and temporally disjunct, separated from issues of marriage and the socio-political world of Richard's London, end quote. So why is this interesting? Remember, in so many of the papers I read, and in so many early readings of the novel, the main dramatic sort of difficulty for Clarissa is whether or not she made the right choice about Peter, and between Peter and Richard. And while she does ask herself that once or twice, maybe 3 or 4 times in the novel, what we don't notice, when we make that assumption about what truly matters to her, what we fail to notice is that when she remembers Burton, she doesn't really remember um, the things that we as readers are associating with Burton, right? That it is a space of courtship, that it is a space of romance, right? Clarissa herself, when she thinks of it, doesn't think of it that way. She thinks of it as something that's sort of like cordoned off and separated from and protected from those sorts of issues, which are much more present to her in the here and now of London in 1923 than they are associated with that past in what I presume to be, 1890s or early 1900s or something like that. Okay. All right. So the development that interests Abel is the development between these two worlds, this sort of female pastoral world that in Clarissa's mind is sort of cordoned off from the present world of marriage and parties and social duties and whatnot, is the development between these worlds, how Clarissa got from the one to the other, and meaning the progression of intervening years between Burton and London, intervening years which the novel gives us readers zero access to. Moreover, these two worlds do not exist in the form of a sequence in the novel, but rather side by side, at least psychologically, forming not a progression, but a grid of oppositions. Okay, and Abel sort of maps this out for us at the end of the next paragraph. On page 31, there's a sentence about a little over halfway through that paragraph at the top of the page. Sentence begins, Clarissa's recollected history proceeds from a female-centered natural world, Burton, to the heterosexual and ando, meaning male-centric social world of London. Woolf structures this progression, again, not as a progression, but as a binary opposition between past and present, between nature and culture, feminine and masculine dispensations. Versions of this opposition between Burton and London reverberate through the novel in rhetorical and narrative juxtapositions. The developmental plot, which slides beneath the more familiar courtship plot through the gap between Clarissa's and Peter's memories, exists as two contrasting moments, and the silence adjoining and dividing them. According to Abel, Mrs. Dalloway aims to resolve these oppositions, first through Clarissa's encounter with Septimus, so see pages 38 to 42 of the chapter. This is in part 3. And second, through the commencement of a new developmental story in the life of Clarissa and Richard's daughter, Elizabeth. So this is the very tail end of the chapter, 42 to 44. But to jump to these resolutions, misses the fully developed psychoanalytic articulation of Clarissa Dalloway's adolescence. So in order to get that, let's really carefully read the next two paragraphs. Okay, this is going to take some time, and I may pause every so often just to give a bit of commentary. Okay, I'll try not to, because I think we should really stick with Abel here. Woolf endows these moments. These moments. What moments? Moments. The developmental plot exists as two contrasting moments, meaning in Burton and in London, and a silence adjoining and dividing them. So Woolf endows these moments with symbolic resonance by a strategy of narrative exclusions. She juxtaposes eras split by 30 years and omits Clarissa's childhood from the novel's temporal frame. There is no past in Mrs. Dalloway anterior to Clarissa's adolescence at Burton, meaning there's no past that's before that adolescence. Within this selective scheme, the earliest remembered scenes become homologous to a conventional narrative point of departure, the description of formative childhood years. The emotional tenor of these scenes, moreover, suggests deferred childhood desire. Clarissa's earliest narrated memories focus on Sally's arrival at Burton, an arrival which infuses the formal, repressive atmosphere with a vibrant female energy. The only picture of Clarissa's early childhood sketched in the novel, by contrast, suggests a tableau of female loss: a dead mother, a dead sister, and a stern maiden aunt, the father's sister, whose hobby of pressing flowers beneath Lettres dictionary suggests to Peter Walsh the cultural oppression of women. In this barren atmosphere, Sally's uninhibited warmth and sensuality immediately spark love in the 18-year-old Clarissa. Sally replaces Clarissa's dead mother and sister, her name even echoing the sister's name, Sylvia. She nurtures Clarissa's intellect and passions, introducing her to the works of William Morris, Shelley, and Plato, and inspiring a love equal to Othello's. Quote, "If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy." End quote. Clarissa feels coming down to dinner to meet Sally. She feels that while coming down to dinner to meet Sally. Moreover, Sally's kiss creates the most exquisite moment in Clarissa's life. Quote, "The whole world might have turned upside down. The others disappeared. There she was alone with Sally, and she felt she had been given a present, wrapped up and told just to keep it, not to look at it. A diamond, something infinitely precious, wrapped up, which, as they walked up and down, she uncovered, or the radiance burnt through, the revelation, the religious feeling, when old Joseph and Peter faced them." End quote. Within the sequence established by the novel, this adolescent love assumes the place of the early female bond, unrepresented within the narrative. Meaning the early female bond between daughter and mother, let's say, or sisters, for instance. The moment Woolf selects to represent Clarissa's past, this atmosphere of Burton, carries the full weight of the pre-Oedipal experience. The phase that Freud discovered, to his surprise, substantially predates and shapes the female version of the Oedipus complex, which in turn initiates all the processes that are designed to make the individual find a place in the cultural community. Right, so remember what I talked about with the Oedipus complex. Right, but the Oedipus complex is not necessarily the beginning of sexuality, right? It's the beginning of the process of being acculturated into society as a particular kind of sexual creature. Before that, in pre-Oedipal stages, right, we are not heterosexual or homosexual according to Freud. We're not masculine or feminine. We're instead a kind of like mishmash of things, as it were. And so what's interesting about the Burton episodes is that this desire, this relationship with Sally in particular, is pre-Oedipal in the sense that Clarissa has not really entered into that process of being acculturated into a social form of socially normal form of heterosexual desire. Okay. According to the Freudian narrative, acculturation meaning being sort of trained and brought up in and developed by being part of a culture into a certain kind of sexuality, exacts renunciation from both men and women, meaning you have to lose something. You'll lose part of what you were before that encounter, right? The Oedipus complex involves something of a loss of that pre-Oedipal mishmash of various sexualities that were at work before that. The loss for women, however, is less well compensated, since the boy's reward will include a woman like the mother, meaning the boy loses the boy must give up, right? Especially when he enters the Oedipus complex, must eventually give up the desire for the mother, but then is compensated well, in some sense, by a substitute. as it were, along with full paternal privileges. Whereas, at some point along the way when he has children of his own, whereas the girl will be requited with at best a child, but no renewed access to the lost maternal body, and no acquisition of paternal power. Encapsulating an image of the turn from mother to father, that, whenever it occurs, terminates the earliest stage of female development, Mrs. Dalloway defines the moment of acculturation as a moment of obstruction, right? So she's reading the moment at the end of the passage above when Joseph and Peter kind of interrupt that religious feeling between Sally and Clarissa as the beginning of the moment of acculturation, right? And that's why it's a moment of obstruction, right? Intervening into what was before that just an ongoing process of pleasure and desire. Masculine intervention, not penis envy, produces this moment in Woolf's account. In contrast to Freud, who locates violence only in the castration thread that terminates the Oedipus complex for the son, Woolf suggests that violence initiates the daughter's Oedipal relation to the father. Okay. What is interesting about Abel's use of psychoanalysis here is that Woolf's novel is not just an object of knowledge, that Freud's theories of the Oedipus complex helps her unpack and explain. Rather, Abel's interest in psychoanalysis enables her to show how Woolf's work actually contributes to psychoanalytic theory, right? And so we get, for instance, at the end of that paragraph, Abel arguing that what Woolf shows us is that it is male interruption, right, as it were, or imposition, rather than some sort of penis envy, right, that actually begins the process of the woman's acculturated sexualization, right. This becomes a bit more explicit, right, as we move into the second and third sections of the chapter. In the second, Abel surveys Freud's theory of female sexuality and femininity, and in the third, she shows how this theory cannot quite account for what occurs in Mrs. Dalloway, an overlapping of masculine and feminine forms in the figure of Clarissa, so think of pages 37 to 38, as well as the simultaneity of her attraction to men and her tendency to fall in love with women, right, which is carried far past Burton and into her London life. This opposition, which moves in accordance with oscillations between the present and the past, Burton and London, or I should say London and Burton, this opposition is recast at the end of the novel into two additional evasions that repress and sublimate this sexually radical position of Clarissa. The choice between men and women, which had been held in suspension for her entire life. And remember, Abel reads her marriage to Richard not so much as a decision to, not so much as the movement into a normal sexuality, not the decision to be attracted to men and to have sexual relations with men instead of women, instead of Sally, for instance, but rather as a kind of revenge against Peter for interrupting and invading what was a fully pleasurable pre-Oedipal relationship with Sally at Burton. Okay, and so part of the sexual components of that pre-Oedipal stage then gets fused after her decision to marry Richard into this kind of what we might call now a kind of bisexuality, although that's certainly not Woolf's word, and it's not a word that Abel uses here either. Okay. So anyway, the choice between men and women, again, which is held in suspension for Clarissa's entire life, not resolved into a single normal sexuality, is subtly revised late in the novel in her encounter with Septimus into a choice between life and death. which is itself also plugged into and associated with the opposition between past and present, Burton and London. And so that whole grid work of binary oppositions that are related and fused together that Abel sketches and outlines for us early in the chapter, here is associated with the much less evenly weighted terms between life and death, right? Which becomes a way for Woolf to sublimate Clarissa's amalgamation of masculinity and femininity, of love of men and women, into a much more normalized sexuality. That will be Abel's argument. Abel's argument is that Septimus is what allows her to be able to do this. Does any of this make sense, though? All right, let's look at 39. Let's skip to 39 to see how Abel does this. So look at 39, middle of the page. Clarissas Meditation on Septimus's death modulates, through her association of passion with death, to a meditation on her relation to her past. Woolf orchestrates the verbal echoes of this passage to evoke with increasing clarity the scene with Sally Seton. It's actually a really interesting reading, right? That in thinking about Septimus, Clarissa is actually thinking about Burton and Sally Seton. To Clarissa, Septimus's choice of a violent early death elicits the notion of a central self preserved, quote, a thing there was that mattered, a thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life. This he had preserved, meaning Septimus. Earlier, Clarissa, that's from Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa had described passion as, quote, something central which permeated, end quote, earlier in the novel. The echoes between these passages, that is, between Clarissa thinking about Septimus and much earlier in the novel when she was thinking about Sally Seton, develop through their similar representations of passion's ebb. Quote, closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. That's from the scene with Clarissa thinking about Septimus. But the close withdrew, the hard softened, it was over, the moment. That's from her thinking about Sally. Clarissa sensed that only death preserves the fading moment of passion, prepares for her repetition of the line from Othello that has signified her love for Sally Seton. So again, that quote from Othello, if 'twere now to die, sorry, now I'm forgetting what it is. If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy. Right, this sentence she thinks about while thinking about Septimus, and it's also the very thing she's thinking about when going down to dinner to see Sally. The metaphor of treasure, which precedes this explicit allusion to the scene with Sally, further connects Clarissa's response to Septimus. Had he plunged holding his treasure, she wonders, with her memory of Sally's kiss as, quote, a present, a diamond, something infinitely precious, end quote. Septimus's death evokes in Clarissa the knowledge of what death saves, and what she has lost. Her grief is not for Septimus, but for herself. This is really interesting. The verbal web Woolf weaves between the two passages summons once again the crucial scene with Sally on the terrace at Burton, enabling Clarissa to confront her loss. Her appreciation of this loss, at last fully present to her consciousness, crystallizes in the contrast that concludes this segment of the passage. Quote, she had schemed, she had pilfered, she was never wholly admirable, and once she had walked on the terrace at Burton, end quote. Let's keep reading. With this naming of the original scene, Woolf abruptly terminates Clarissa's recollection, replaying with a single stroke Peter Walsh's interruption, the sudden imposition of the granite wall. This time, however, the masculine intervention, right, which is the commencement of Clarissa's initial social acculturation into a normal sexuality, which kind of goes awry and becomes abnormal, is enacted not by Peter, but by Richard, and not as external imposition, but as choice. Clarissa's unexpected thought of Richard abruptly and definitively terminates the memory of Sally, pivoting the scene from past to present, the mood from grief to joy. It was due to Richard. She had never been so happy. The dramatic and unexplained juxtaposition encapsulates the developmental plot from Burton to London and the dynamics of its central scenes. However, this final replay of the developmental turn represents the abrupt transition positively. The joy inspired by Clarissa's thought of Peter persists as she celebrates this having done with the triumphs of youth. Woolf does not fill in the gap splitting past from present, grief from joy. We can only speculate that Septimus's sacrificial gift includes a demonstration of Clarissa's alternatives, to preserve the intensity of passion through death, or to accept the changing offerings of life. Through Septimus, Woolf recasts the developmental impasse as a choice between development, right, getting over Burton, getting over this passionate allure, of this passionate feeling towards Sally, or death. Being trapped in the past, as it were. By recalling to Clarissa the power of her past and the only method of eternalizing it, meaning death, Septimus enables Clarissa to acknowledge and renounce the hold that Burton has at her, that Sally has on her, and in some sense maybe even that Peter has on her, to embrace the imperfect pleasures of adulthood more completely. So the interesting reading, right, of this closing scene. What other critics have read as a second birth or awakening for Clarissa, or as a vicarious experience of death, or as a philosophical enlightenment, Abel reads ambivalently as a decision to move on from the female pastoral PreOedipal world of Burton, to which Clarissa can never return. To choose to continue to live in London, meaning in the here and now, with Richard, and to renounce and to abandon this world, this past, this treasure, which can be saved only in death, and to choose the world of men, of London, of modern life and society, which Elizabeth will be better equipped to navigate than her mother, is really what's going on here, according to Abel. Mrs. Dalloway, in her words, quote, turns from Clarissa precisely at the moment in the narrative when we might get some answers about the depth and endurance of Clarissa's change while thinking about Septimus's death. Will her choice last, we might ask ourselves? Does she actually give up the PreOedipal pastoral world? Woolf evades these questions, according to Abel, by having Clarissa's return to her party close the novel. Likewise, for Abel, Woolf evades a more direct articulation of Clarissa's sexual impasse between men and women by recasting her options in the novel's closing pages in the less evenly weighted terms of life and death. To stay stuck and mired in this past in a kind of mishmash of masculine and feminine desire is then associated with death at the end of this novel, and to leave that behind is to choose life, as imperfect as it may be, is to choose normality, as it were. And lastly, by leaving the future of Elizabeth open-ended, or rather unopened, quote, Woolf encloses in her text the unwritten text of the next developmental narrative, end quote. All of this evasion and repression and sublimation for Abel and any psychoanalytic critic is noticeable primarily because they are attuned to evasions and to reading substitutions, translations, and unconvincing resolutions as moments of repression and sublimation, either for the characters or for the author herself. Unlike Ferrier, who I will discuss in my close reading lectures next, Abel's psychoanalytic approach to Mrs. Dalloway is less interested in madness than in psychical mechanisms of a novel, the way one can extract some sort of developmental narrative of the psyche from the novel's own situations, silences, evasions, repressions, and resolutions, or lack thereof. In our own readings of Mrs. Dalloway, perhaps it might be fruitful to wonder how Freud's notion of the unconscious might problematize the notion of a stream of consciousness. If we understand passages in Mrs. Dalloway to be the records of characters' thoughts, then do we ever see the record of that which they do not consciously think? Can we see the unconscious at work in the novel? Abel sees it in the narrative dispersion and distribution, and in the sort of verbal echoes between Clarissa thinking about Septimus and thinking about Sally, right? And also sees it in the modulation of different binary oppositions. Past and present man and woman is associated with Burton and London. In the closing scene, it all becomes aligned with the choice between life and death, right? Making the decision of one over the other much easier. Where do we see the unconscious at work? And what happens when we think of the narrative exclusions as potential repressions? Where does that exclusion go? How is it sublimated? And instead of presuming a character's sexuality, presuming a character's sexuality to be static in a novel, perhaps we might think of the sexuality of a character as something that the novel itself must develop according to specific conditions of the character's life. What, for instance, is Septimus's sexuality? Gender. What is his developmental story? These would be psychoanalytic questions that a psychoanalytic scholar may or may not pursue, often equipped with a great deal of reading in the works of Freud, Melanie Klein, and others. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to end this unit on psychoanalysis here. In your textbook, the Parker book, you get a little bit about the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And some of that may be useful for thinking about Ferrier's book chapter. But I will say here that I think my feeling is that Lacan is a bit too difficult to sum up very quickly. If any of you are interested in learning a bit more about Lacan, or want to talk about those passages from Parker's chapter, I'm very happy to do that in office hours or through correspondence. But my feeling is he's maybe just a bit too tricky and difficult to try to sum up in a video lecture like this. Okay, all right. So I hope that helps a little bit for trying to understand how psychoanalysis may or may not be useful. For rethinking or reorienting ourselves toward the literatures that we're reading, so that we're paying attention to things like exclusions and reading things like substitutions and slippages and translations and occlusions as narrative repressions of one form or another, and that the thing that's sort of shuffled off to the side doesn't go away, but might actually be sublimated in one way or another into something else. Okay. All right, so up next are some lecture series, are some lecture series, oh my goodness, are some lectures on close reading, which I hope I'll be able to post later today. If not, I'll see you tomorrow, where we'll talk about feminism. Okay.